Hi everyone, my name is Aindri
And I'm Mehak.
and welcome to All About That Reef podcast.
So for today's episode, we'll be exploring the world of freediving and snorkeling. When you think about the ways of interacting with the ocean, there are so many different ways of doing that. And so far, we've spoken about scuba diving, we've spoken about sort of underwater photography
And deep diving.
and deep tech diving. So today, just to go a little bit into the sort of unexplored world of free diving and snorkeling, and just off the top of my head, I think all of us have, not all obviously, but a lot of us have tried snorkeling.
Definitely.
In fact, it's I think one of the most accessible ways to sort of explore and interact with the ocean. But even when we do snorkeling, there's a number of different etiquettes that you need to be following, just to make sure that you are minimizing your impact when you're doing this. So just some things that come right off the top is that you shouldn't be trying to touch, chase, or like hold and grasp like fish or even turtles, which we see happening a lot these days. Also,
Standing on turtles and riding
Yeah.
animals, I don't think that's very environmentally friendly at all. And of course, we're not going to go to Yala and like ride these animals. Yeah. So I think it's common sense as well, but I think it's great that we're bringing awareness to it right now. And like you mentioned, all of that snorkeling etiquette, on top of that, there's like wearing reef safe sunscreen and not stepping on corals.
not leaving anything behind, not taking
Yes.
anything.
Yeah.
Not sort of try to feed the fish or feed the animals. I mean, you would think most of this would be common sense, and some of it is, but I think when the opportunity presents itself, people tend to, interact in the activity, because, I mean, sometimes it's nice for an Instagram page, or sometimes it's an experience they want to have. But it's important to remember that you are interacting with wild animals. This is a wild space, and there are certain protocols that you need to be following to make sure that you're not actually having a negative impact on it, because I think it little bit beats the purpose of like snorkeling and swimming in the ocean and like having this like very immersive like nature
Encounter with wildlife.
and then you're sort of really taking away from that experience in a way. But to go back to free diving, it's relatively unknown in Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka actually does have quite a long and rich history of free diving. And Nandri, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually the guest that we're bringing in today, I think he would have more information about this. But from what I remember, like I've been hearing, like within the dive community, there is so much of like history to people who were the pioneers of free diving and diving. So it was this club, or I would say, it was a club that was founded called Reef, Ceylon. And the pioneers of diving and free diving would be people like Rodney Jonklas and
Tony Buxton.
Tony Braxton, and like there were few Mark Wilson and different like pioneers of free diving and diving. And this is like in 1952, and they used to also have spearfishing competitions out at sea, maybe like in the Himalaya and things like that. There's actually like an interesting video of it, and also a picture of Rodney Jonklas spearfishing at the Great Basses. So all this has a lot of history and significance in Sri Lanka, and also about the pearl divers that goes down to like the 7th century or something. So it's interesting that we are actually talking to this guest about free diving and his thoughts on the whole historical significance and also what it is like now in Sri Lanka. Shout out to Pass It On for sponsoring this episode.
And now we're back. Hi everyone, today we have joining with us Kalim Iqbal. He's known in the diving community as one of Sri Lanka's first free diving instructors. Thank you for joining us today, Kalim.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a bit about how you started freediving and what sparked your passion for it.
Sure. Despite living in Colombo for most of my life, I never actually engaged much with the sea, which I think is fairly common for most people living in Sri Lanka. But I was always attracted to it, and I always wondered, looking out at the shoreline, what's beyond there or what's in there. I started scuba diving around 2018 and fell in love with it immediately. This, got over my fears of having to breathe through the regulator underwater and all that, and I did it as much as I could. Later that first year, I think, I was watching a show on Netflix called Fish People. And there was this woman hunting underwater. And the first thing I noticed was that she wasn't using any scuba gear. So I was like, what is she doing? And then I discovered freediving. So the first opportunity I had in 2019, I went to the Maldives, did a course, learned all about the risks of freediving, which I didn't know before starting to do that.
Yeah.
And that's how it started. I immediately realized this is something that I wanted to do alongside scuba,
Yeah.
We joke amongst our friends, but call scuba divers dirty tank breathers, but I quite like both forms of diving.
It's a different experience.
It's a different experience and it has its uses. But yeah, that's basically how I started.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you didn't dive for most of your life and then
No,
you
no,
started
no.
and then
It's
in
only
a
been
really short time span you went from diving, also free diving and also becoming a free diving
7 years
instructor.
now.
Yeah. So you spoke about scuba diving and free diving. So I just want to backtrack a little bit and ask you whether you can explain a little bit about what exactly is free diving and how
Sure.
does that differ from snorkeling and scuba diving?
Sure. So free diving is breath hold diving. You're diving free, so to speak, without any gear, without a tank, and it's entirely based on your capacity of breath hold. As opposed to scuba diving, where you're using self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. It's not dissimilar to snorkeling. In fact, the joke among some of us is that free diving is just advanced snorkeling, because you're basically snorkeling at the surface, and then you prepare yourself for a dive, you take a big breath, and then you dive for as long as you can, or safely possible. So it is an extension of snorkeling, I'd say. And for a lot of snorkelers especially when they've been snorkeling on a clear day, a clear reef, and they've wondered, oh, I'd like to go down there and see that reef or see that turtle or see that, whatever marine life in a closer way, that's probably, the next step for them, learn to free dive safely.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the different types of free diving that exists?
Yeah, sure. So free diving, first I'll go back slightly, has existed for millennia. We'll come to it later when we're talking, obviously. But the modern form of free diving has split into recreational, competitive, and then also the original form of free diving, which is gathering of food, of which spearfishing is an important part of, or a huge part of. So globally, it's driven by, I would say, spearfishing, recreational diving, which is, people just exploring reefs, exploring wrecks, exploring the ocean, and there's a huge competitive scene that's formed around the world.
That's quite interesting to know, there are different types, although people just look at free diving as just one.
Even the competitive free diving is split into multiple forms of it. There's so many disciplines, probably 10, 15 disciplines. Some of the more popular ones are constant weight, which is what we know, which is just 2 fins. You're using a constant weight and you're going down and coming up. The record is well over 100 meters. Then there's bifin, the monofin, which is, you've seen the mermaid style single fin. Yeah. People pull themselves down on the line without using fins at all, and then back up again using their buoyancy. That's free immersion. And then there are the pool-based freediving disciplines, which is the breath hold one, which the record is over 12 minutes. Somebody's held their breath static for over 12 minutes. And then dynamic, where they'll swim underwater in a pool or a controlled environment for hundreds of meters.
Wow. So I think obviously we've been diving for quite some time, and you've mentioned how you've experienced free diving in particular countries.
Sure.
And there's this one experience that stood out. Can you tell everyone about that particular experience? I think it was quite interesting, so I'm sure they might find this interesting.
Which one? Going out to the blue hole?
Yes, and how you saw
Yes,
this.
so I did go out to Egypt, to Dahab, which is, a mecca of free divers, as you called it, earlier. And it was great. It was diving on the Red Sea, amazing visibility, great coral, marine life, corals, just a stunning place to dive, whether you're scuba diving or not. And I went there to do an IDA course, an advanced course, an IDA 3 course. So I had to get to like, I think 28 meters or 30 meters. No, I think 26 or 28 meters. So the final day, the final dives were at the Blue Hole.
Wow.
And it's quite a daunting experience because you know the history of it. At least I did. I knew the history of it. And there's a sign as soon as you get there that says 93 divers to date have died here.
Oh, wow.
So it's you're aware of the risks. And if you know much about it, if you've seen the film on Netflix, there's this massive arch underneath at 57 meters, and people try to go under it and come out and exit out into the Red Sea, which is quite mad, yeah. And a lot of people have tried that and have not made it.
Yeah.
The bottom's at 93 meters. So it's not a place for competitive freediving because now competitive divers are going to 100 plus. But it's an amazing place to train. And you know how when we dive in Colombo, there's one buoy, one line, and we're all sharing it.
Yeah.
There you go out, and across the mouth, there's a whole bunch of buoys with lines, and you look down and you see all these world-class divers just training, going down. Really, really, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you did mention that it has the history of it, but as someone who doesn't know the history, could you just give us some of that history? Like, why is the Blue Hole so special?
The Blue Hole special for the reasons I just mentioned, because when it's a great place to train because of the risks of diving deep to make that challenge of the arch, which local divers now actually frown upon. They don't like people attempting that challenge anymore because so many people have died even recently.
But there was there was an experience where you, wherever like the dive operation that you were freediving.
Yes. I will also say that, I missed my point there, but yeah, that experience about that place, I dived with the shop that Stephen Keenan founded. So if anybody has seen the show on Netflix, The Deepest Breath, that was his shop. And on the wall, you're in the company of these great freedivers because on the wall there was a cigarette pack mounted, a crumpled pack of Marlboro Lights, and it said, to Alexei from Guillaume. And if you know these names, Alexei is Alexei Molchanov, whose mom basically founded the modern sport of freediving. She unfortunately went missing in a freediving accident, was never seen again, but she basically started, one of the founders of the modern sport of freediving. Alexei is now a world record holder himself. Guillaume Neri is maybe my favorite freediver because he makes these amazing films that you can watch on YouTube, including The Deepest, One Breath Around the World. It's a 12-minute video. It's a compilation of freediving footage around the world that him and his partner at the time compiled, and she shot it entirely on breath hold as well.
Wow.
Stunning cinematography. I encourage everybody to watch that. But Guillaume, before he was a filmmaker, he was a competitive diver. And he had been training out, he'd been competing in Cyprus, I think, and the organizers unfortunately made a cardinal error, which is they'd set the line much deeper than he had trained for. And you and I might be able to make a gain of 5 meters, 10 meters on a good day of diving because we're still diving at shallower depths, but for the pros to gain 5 meters, it's going to take weeks and months of training. They'd set his thing 10 meters too deep.
Oh no.
So I don't know the numbers, but for example, let's say if he was targeting a 110 meter dive that day, they'd set the card at 120. So when he got there and he was on the way back up, he knew he was in trouble. So I think he had a lung expansion injury, which is quite painful. And he got back up to the surface, and somebody advised him to smoke an entire packet of cigarettes to coat his damaged alveoli in the lungs with tar. So I think he made it through 12 cigarettes because I counted there were, I think, 8 left.
Really?
Yeah.
It's still there.
It's still there. So he'd gifted it to Alexei Molchanov, who in turn I think had gifted it to Stephen Keenan. And Stephen, when he formed Dahab Freedivers, where we were doing the courses, he just dismounted it. It was a cool story, I thought. But it also highlighted the risks of freediving.
Yeah, I think, incredible story. Like, definitely should go check those documentaries out.
Yeah.
But like you did say, it did highlight the risks of freediving, and even like everything you spoke about before, like people who haven't surfaced, like 93 divers have died at this spot.
I want to say though that 93 included scuba divers. So you can be just as much an idiot with the scuba tank.
So can you talk us a little bit as to, I mean, it's obvious that freediving is dangerous, but can you talk us a little bit through its risks and like the safety aspects of freediving?
Yeah. Freediving is, let's make no bones about it, it's an extreme activity. I mean, it's brilliant, and we'll get into the reasons why I love it, and the benefits of it, and how to safely enjoy it. But it is at the heart of it, it's an extreme activity, and it's not something to be taken lightly. You have to do it with a very, very healthy respect for the ocean, your own body, your own limits, and also the limits and capabilities of your body. So the one rule in freediving is you never ever dive alone, and I have loads of stories. I've seen people who it hasn't gone well for them because they've dived alone, or they've done a breath hold dive without knowing what they were doing. So because of that, it is an extreme activity. To go a little bit deeper into why the risk, what the risk is, it's because it's to do with the partial pressure of oxygen. I won't get into the science of it, but when you go down and your lungs compress, the air in your lungs also compresses. This is a very layman's, very quick explanation. If you push past your limits and you breathe too much of that air that you've now compressed at the bottom, whatever depth, as you go back up, your lungs expanding, but there isn't that much air because you breathe too much. You push past your natural limits. Suddenly, there isn't enough air to fill your lungs, so you get into a hypoxic situation. So basically, you're cutting air off to your brain, and you go to sleep very quickly. And that is a blackout. So it's called shallow water blackout, but they often call it ascent-related blackout because it rarely happens at depth. Mostly happens on the way up. It is an extreme activity, but even if you do have a blackout on the way up or at the surface, if you have a buddy who knows what they're doing, and they are trained to look out for it, and they are watching you like we do, always one up, one down, always having eyes on the person, it's actually much safer than scuba diving. With scuba, of course, the risks of narcosis, running out of air, exactly, especially tech diving and stuff. And even at recreational depths, at 40 meters, if something goes wrong with the tank, you could be in real trouble there.
Yeah,
whereas with you're depending on a lot of mechanical or material equipment. Whereas with freediving, you don't push as hard or for as long because you're relying on your limited breath hold. And if you have somebody who knows what they're doing, it is generally safer. But that's not to take away from the fact that it's a very extreme activity, and you have to be trained or know what you're doing before you attempt it.
Yeah, I'm glad we brought this up. We talked about the fun stuff about freediving, but also the safety behind it. So this is an interesting documentary that I watched. I'm not too sure if you watched it. It's called Yago, Life Underwater.
Sure.
So it's about these freedivers. They're called the Bajo people in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Across the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia.
And they're called the sea nomads. So they have genetically enlarged spleens that allow them to stay long periods in the water.
Yeah, I'd love for that.
So it shows that, freediving is also a form of hunting from back then, when looking at the history of it and stuff like that. Yeah. But there are also some legal restrictions to it now, especially in Sri Lanka, where spearfishing is banned. But I've come to know that, it still happens. It's
So let's go back a bit. The reason people started freediving is initially, like I said earlier, to harvest. So whether that's fish, shoot fish, gather lobsters, or pearls, like they did in Sri Lanka and this part of the world back in the day. Humans have been doing it for a very long time. That's only the recent history. One of the things you learn when you do a freediving course is the mammalian, or it's no longer called the mammalian, it's called the diving reflex. So there are physiological changes that happen when you dive that allow you to dive further. So I'll come back to the point you were saying, but this is actually quite interesting. If I asked you to hold your breath on land, and let's say you were able to do it for like a minute, I'd immediately know that you could hold it for at least 2 minutes in water, or at least, something like that. More. It's because when you're immersed in water, your brain immediately goes into the mode diving mode, because your sinuses, your eyes, ears, your face access sensors and thinks, okay, this person is going back into the water to hunt, so we have to help them. One of the effects you get is, and it's one way we actually trigger the dive response, is by hanging on a rope in order for your spleen to pump more red blood cells into your bloodstream, which is what has happened with those guys. So that's an example of evolution in action, I think, or at least some people seem to think. And it's because they've been doing it for generations, and obviously the people that were able to dive more at one point had a larger spleen, was able to get more food, so his family ate more, and then, over millennia it spread into the entire tribe, or at least those people, those genetic traits came
That's
to the
actually
forefront.
so cool, because it sounds like in some way that like we as humans are like genetically coded to be
We are,
divers,
we are,
free
we are,
divers, which
we
is
are,
just a
we are.
fascinating way to think about it.
Yeah, we
There
are.
is
We
a book
definitely
about
are.
it.
Yeah, it's actually a huge part of the courses we teach also, to let people know that, look, this is actually something that's in us. And even when you go diving for the first time, if you remember, I told you that the first thing you'll feel is psychological fear. That's a modern phenomenon. It's our bodies actually, you'll have the psychological urge to breathe far sooner than you have a physiological urge to breathe, because physiologically we can actually do a lot more than we think. It's just what prevents us or makes us want to come up and fin to the surface really quick, is that psychological fear of thinking, oh, I can't breathe anymore, I haven't breathed in like a minute, or I'm gonna die. Yeah, but we actually can do it for a lot longer. So a big part of the thrill for a lot of people with free diving or that sort of activity is going into that kind of like Zen mode, overcoming those fears, that sort of thing.
So to talk about the pearl divers that you mentioned, I actually was in Mannar recently, and I was
Nice
trying
one,
to
yeah.
gather some
Yeah.
information on them. And
By the Doric bungalow, did you go there?
I'm not too sure where I went.
Yeah, that's where
But
it
that's
is.
when I came across
Yeah.
this idea, and so from my understanding, pearl diving has been happening in Sri Lanka since the 7th century onwards,
yeah.
and it was actually a really large maritime trade and something
It
that
was
would bring
huge.
in
Yeah.
a lot to the economy at that time.
Yes.
But now it's not something that happens, because in
No.
the 20th century, the pearls were over harvested. I mean, which
Yes.
on a side note
Yeah.
is a sign of it's a valuable lesson to us on how we
On
should do
conservation,
sustainable
yeah, of
resource
course.
exploitation
Yeah.
if we are. But I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the history of pearl diving in Sri Lanka as a form of free
Yeah.
diving, and also
Yeah.
what that space, the free diving space looks like in Sri Lanka now.
Sure. Interesting you brought up the pearl diving, because for a couple of years now, I've been wanting to actually explore that, maybe recreate some of those dives. I've read about it extensively. My dad just gave me a couple of books about it, which he had in his collection. I've read online, I've seen loads of photos. I once went to an exhibition as well that had a bunch of photos from that period. It was a huge deal, not only in Sri Lanka, in this part of the world, even in the Middle East, in the Emirates, before they discovered oil and gas, it was pearl diving.
Pearls, yeah.
So the Mannar area where they dive for pearls, you'd find divers from Sri Lanka, South India, Bahrain, what is modern day Bahrain and Oman, and the Emirates, who would come to Sri Lanka, spend time here, and dive for pearls. So it's a big part of our history. It's kind of forgotten now because, like you said, the fisheries died out about 100 years ago for overfishing. Also, I think cheaper pearls, like artificial pearls,
Yeah.
they were able to make them somewhere. So the demand for pearls isn't as great anymore. But yeah, it was a huge deal back in the day, and a big part of Sri Lanka's maritime history.
Yeah. And what about what the free diving space looks like in Sri Lanka right now? What is the main reason people free dive here?
So now they do it to spearfish, which is a controversial topic because it is illegal. And yeah, I think it's on the balance of it, it's probably the right thing to do. But it still happens extensively up and down both coasts, especially on the southern coasts. And contrary to belief, it's not just for tourists. I've seen locals, I know locals who go out regularly, spear an octopus, spear something for lunch, I mean, they live by the sea, and they take what they can. I'll tell you what, I think 2020, 2021, I was coming back from a fishing trip the day, and as we entered the reef gap in Dehiwala and going to the Wadia in Vellavata, I counted 12 spear fishermen in the water in Colombo and Dehiwala. This is 2021. You don't see them as much anymore after the crocodiles started coming. But I counted 12 that day, and we gave one of them a ride back because he was out on the reef and he was waving us down, right? And so I told the boatman, okay, let's go get him. He jumped onto the boat. He had a homemade spear gun. And I asked him, I said, like, what are you shooting? He said, yeah, I did. He knew it was illegal. And he had like 15 fish, reef fish, strapped in a thing around his waist, which he'd shot. And he said, no, I don't shoot parrotfish, I don't shoot parrotfish, you know, because he knew it was wrong.
Yeah.
So I guess he was aware that parrotfish are very important for, you know, reef health.
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting that in the heart of Colombo,
Yeah.
it existed.
But backtracking a bit, so the reason that it got banned was, I think we all know about this picture that went viral in 2017 of this hump headdress that was...
Yeah, that was really unfortunate.
Yeah. And I mean, since then, so you're saying 2021, you saw 12 spearfish fishermen.
Spearos, gender neutral term.
So it kind of shows like, I mean, although it's banned, it still happens.
Definitely
and
happens,
when looking at the regulations of it and like legalization of it, it doesn't seem like there is any kind of enforcement that has...
No. Occasionally you'll see a news article about a Russian or a Ukrainian tourist down south that was arrested. And frankly, they spearfish a lot down there. One of my first scuba dives, I went out on the Talpe Reef around the same time, I would say 1920 or 1819. And as we come up from a dive, I saw a hooded figure just come up from the reef near us. And when he saw the boat, he went back down. So I asked the boatman, I said, Kaudume? He's like, yeah, he's a Russian guy who just lives here. You know, he just goes out spearfishing alone every day, very dangerous, very stupid, but it happens. I think there's a conversation to be had about it.
And I think it's important that we have this conversation as well, so that it gets people talking.
Sure.
Yeah. I think with the spearfishing, like you said, there's a lot of Russian and Eurasian tourists that are interested in doing it as a sport. So I remember a few years ago, the government, the sports minister, if I'm not wrong, did try to bring spearfishing back.
Yes.
But again, there was a lot of concern within environmentalists and that sort of. So the ban still holds.
Yes.
And like coming from a conservation standpoint, like I can understand why there is a ban on spearfishing. The ecological consequences of spearfishing are pretty clear. Like just to name a few, it would be that spearfishing usually targets the larger reef fish, right? These tend to be predators. So when you spearfish them, it means that you're removing the top predators from an ecosystem, which has cascading effects. But also a lot of these fish tend to be protogynous, which means that initially they spend their life as females and then they transition to males, which then means that when you're spearfishing, you're removing a specific sex which affects their reproductive success. And also, obviously, the spearfishing targets the big, the colorful fish, specific species that usually tend to be endangered, and then that again means that, like, I think there have been studies that have shown that in reefs that have spearfishing, the mean density of these reef fish reduces, but also that the mean size of the remaining spearfish also reduced due to evolution, right? So
I have seen the studies, I have read the reports, and I'm not going to dispute them. I want to be clear, one of the reasons I did start freediving was to spearfish.
Oh, wow.
But unfortunately it's illegal in Sri Lanka, so I can't indulge. I do think it has merit, spearfishing, but in a country like Sri Lanka with such poorly enforced laws and no social contract between the authorities, the ocean, and the people who depend on it. Sri Lankans have this very extractive relationship with the ocean, I think. They're always looking at what they can get out of it and what they can throw into it. There's very little care for it. The argument against conventional fishing is the amount of bycatch. All of the examples you gave happen far worse when people go out with fishing lines or with large nets, or even, in the extreme examples of bottom trawling. Those are far more destructive practices, I think. This probably relates into a wider conversation about consuming, ocean protein.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I do think that I would like for there to be a place for it, but with strong enforcement. In some countries which have this strong social contract with the ocean, hunters know what species they can take in what season, what size they're allowed to take, what size they're not allowed to take, and they strictly follow those because they understand that the health of the reef and all of the subsequent factors are at play. So unfortunately, we don't have that level of enforcement, nor do we have that level of education. So yeah, on the balance of it, like I said earlier, I'd love to be able to spearfish. I really would. I think it'd be a great way of hunting my own meat. It will give you a better appreciation of the food you consume, the fish you eat, rather than just going and buying a packaged thing in the supermarket, which probably has a far bigger ecological impact than the reasons you gave out. But at the same time, I don't think Sri Lanka is ready for it, for the reasons you mentioned earlier, for the obvious reasons of people just thinking that the ocean is just going to provide whatever they want and they don't have to look after it at all.
And when looking at the regulations in other countries and the countries that do allow spearfishing, I think I've heard like stories of like the way they like harvest for lobsters and spearfish for lobster hunt. Like I don't know, what is it called? Lobster hunting or
Gathering, sure.
But I mean the regulations that are there for like in Australia and things like that are properly enforced and fined. And they know the repercussions of it.
Sure.
So regardless of whether they're doing it recreationally or for their livelihoods or for tourism perspective, I think it's important that if it's a ban, it should be enforced properly and fined properly as well.
I've actually seen people out in Colombo on scuba tanks spearfishing, which is frankly unconscionable. It's so unfair. There's no sporting element to it. At least in places where spearfishing is legal, it is allowed on breath hold, because then it's actually a sporting activity which actually challenges you and gives the prey a chance, right? You're not going to be able to spend 5 minutes down there without risking your life, trying to get a bigger fish. But it happens unfortunately in Colombo with on scuba tanks, which I think is really poor form. But then again, that ties into the economics of it. These are poor marginalized fisher communities, which you probably studied about, and they're not going to be too concerned about regulatory frameworks or these theories when they have to put food on the table. So there's a lot of factors at play. There's a lot of dynamics. I worth a long conversation.
I think that plays into a lot of conversations that we have with regards to like conservation and like how is it that we can motivate conservation amongst sort of communities that have to think about their immediate survival, right? Like a lot of conversations you have with fisher folk will be like, why should I care about protecting this when I have to care about putting food down on the table for tomorrow? So I think the conversation of spearfishing and like whether it should be legalized is quite controversial.
Super controversial.
So I don't want to endorse it in any way or form. But
I do.
But I do think it was valuable that we had this discussion and also that we bring in these different perspectives so that people can mull it over a little bit and also think about in the future, like if there is going to be either stricter enforcement or whether they're thinking of lifting the ban, really understand why they're doing that and which sort of stakeholder groups are they trying to please. Because from what happened a few years ago, it was very much for a tourist perspective. It was very much recreational.
It was very much under pressure from a local bunch of, like a local politician, let's just say. It was his electorate, I'm assuming, and there was, a bunch of dive shops that said, look, we've got all these Far Eastern tourists that really want to do it and we should be legally allowed to do it, and then they put pressure on.
And then when you think of enabling it for that stakeholder group, you're not enabling it for a stakeholder group that essentially needs it for its survival, but you're doing it for like a tourism point of perspective. But when you also think about tourism in Sri Lanka, like there is far greater income you can bring about by taking scuba divers, by taking snorkelers, by taking tourists to actually see and appreciate these reef fish, because they're really beautiful and some of them are like really large. And even that humphead wrasse that was spearfished back in 2017, that was a known humphead wrasse that a lot of divers were taking. So there was a long-term income that was generated from this. And then yes, there is an income to be generated from taking people out for sports spearfishing, but that's a very short-term one person like who benefits from it. So really also considering all of this when you bring in the debate as to
absolutely.
what spearfishing
There's loads of factors
like.
at play.
I think this was like a super, super interesting discussion, and I hope it provides some perspective
Yeah.
to everybody that's listening as
Definitely.
well.
I mean, it's not just hunting out on the reefs, though. Especially in places like Hawaii and stuff. And I love watching those videos. People go out and hunt pelagic fish out at sea. Which that maybe arguably does not cause as much damage to a reef. And there's species that you can target that are more plentiful, maybe, or faster breeding. So it's not necessarily just because maybe there are ways to structure a ban, maybe not within like the first initial zone just off of the coast, maybe out deep out at sea. Somebody's willing to do it.
Yeah.
But then again, Sri Lanka doesn't really have a lot of pelagic fish flying around, swimming around because it's kind of overfished. So
Yeah.
that's why the focus is on the reefs.
Yeah.
So I guess spearfishing is a taboo topic, and I'm glad we actually brought this up. as
Totally
well.
not taboo. We just spent 15 minutes talking about it.
I think now though we maybe should move on from
Yeah, but
spearfishing.
a bit out of topic. You spoke about Hampet Raz, and they have a 30-year lifespan, and they're known to be the wise men of the reef.
Yeah.
So it's kind of sad to know
Yeah.
that like something.
Yeah, it sucks. That was really unfortunate. And if you've been to Unawatana lately, that reef is dead. There's nothing to see. It's really quite poor out there.
Yeah. But coming back into freediving,
Sure.
tell us something that you or the listeners could learn from freediving.
As a person, like what are the skills you gain both physically and mentally?
There's loads. How much time do I have?
Lighten the conversation a bit.
To end on a positive
No.
note.
Look, it's not for everybody. I've had people come out with me and they've really struggled to equalize and they haven't been able to do it. And they've had to go back and work, or they found it to work on it and it was too strenuous for them and it was just too scary and they haven't been able to overcome those fears. But for people who have stuck with it, and for myself, they've found it to be quite rewarding. It is a nicer form of diving for me than scuba, because with the scuba, especially when you've got the tank, the VCD, all of you, it's quite restrictive with the regulator in your mouth. You do feel more free when you're free diving. You do feel like you're among the fishers. It's really a feeling of freedom if you're able to get over that initial psychological fear, or you're in a decent diving shape. In diving, I think it helps you with self-mastery. It helps you with overcoming your fears, especially if you've got lots of self-doubt or you're afraid. And this is a good, safe-ish way and an interesting, exciting way to kind of push your limits and kind of overcome those fears. I mean, there's loads of benefits to it. You guys know very well, being out in the ocean, it's blue therapy, right? It's so great for your mental health. It's just, some days even when you've been out, when the conditions haven't been great or the visibility is not good, you still enjoy a nice day out on the sea because you're in this wide expanse of blue.
It really fixes all my problems.
Yeah, I know. Every time I go out,
temporary
I come
numbness.
back really happy. Probably a good time to tell people to do come out in Colombo, free diving with us.
Yes.
We go out to the Sierra, which is a fantastic.
Marketing.
I know. I
I'm
mean,
joking.
we've got an informal community going, and we dive regularly,
Yeah.
as and when schedules allow, because none of us are diving professionals. But yeah, it's a multi-level dive site. I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with the Sierra or the story of the Sierra, so I won't bore everybody with that. But the front deck is only at 8 meters, and you can see it most days. So it gives people confidence, like, oh, that's all I have to go. It's fine, I can go. And then as you get better and more confident, you can go deeper, maybe do a swim through, or go down to the bottom at 23 meters, or swim around the ship or something.
Yeah.
So it's a multi-level site. It's quite accessible. It's just 8 kilometers off the coast. It's fantastic. We're very fortunate to have it here.
And you mentioned that, anyone can come out to see, but for a beginner, could you just explain a bit about what they need to know or prepare for before coming on a dive with you?
They'll have to come and do a course with me.
Trade secrets.
Yeah, no, I take loads of people out. That's how it started. So that's actually an interesting or fun way to talk about how I started teaching. When I did that first course in 2019, I looked for people to dive. I met this woman, Sabine Samaravikrama, who doesn't live here anymore. You know Sabine. she was also a trained free diver, and we said, okay, yeah, we should dive together. And we did a bunch of dives. But then we also had to grow the community because it's just the both of us. And there wasn't really anybody else. And very soon after that, COVID happened. So we couldn't really fly an instructor in. People couldn't fly out to do courses, even people who were interested. So I started teaching people the little bit that I know. It's probably a bad idea because I had just done one course myself, and I wasn't very experienced. But it started like that, and then this opportunity came to be certified. We did an instructor training course, I think the first one ever in Colombo.
Wow.
Last year, and a whole bunch of us got trained to be instructors, which was quite challenging. I had to demonstrate, you have to demonstrate mastery over various aspects, and I had to do like 32-meter dives. So it's actually a struggle to find that depth. So I talked to Darshana Jayawardena, and he kind of gave me some coordinates of where to go. And he was quite right. We found 33 meters, I think, straight past cargo.
Okay.
And that was good enough for everybody to do their deep dives. Yeah. But I still take people out who want to come and try it. Like a Discover Scuba dive, I call it like a Discovery Free dive.
And just to be out at sea.
Yeah, just be out. I'll give them like an hour's crash course on land, kind of what to expect. And then we'll go out to sea and we'll try it gently, maybe pull yourself down the line, practice your breath hold. For most people, it's very daunting, no matter how cool it looks and how much you want to try it. The first time you go out and you hold your breath under the water, it's quite a daunting, challenging thing. So
Yeah, I can only imagine.
yeah.
But yeah, sounds really cool. I think we had some really interesting discussions. So thank you so much for your time. I hope our listeners have something to take away from this, whether that's on free diving or spearfishing.
Bring me back for a longer debate on spearfishing.
Not so sure about that. But yeah, also thank you so much to all of our listeners for tuning in. Hope it was interesting.
This podcast is a Creator Cast production.